Story 1. The Mysterious Invitation. New Year's Eve is a night of hope, celebration, and the promise of change. For many, it's a chance to start over, to leave behind regrets and failures, and to embrace new beginnings. But for Olivia, David, and Cassidy, it became something far more sinister. A night that marked the opening of a gateway to horrors unimaginable. The three were strangers living in different cities, leading entirely separate lives. Yet, on the same freezing December evening, each received a chillingly peculiar invitation from an unknown source. Do you want to change your life? Do you want to touch something extraordinary? Embrace the new year with a special invitation. Let us guide you to the start of something greater. The words seemed crafted with care, written to speak directly to each recipient's deepest desires. Olivia stumbled upon hers in her inbox, buried between spam and forgotten newsletters. The sender was anonymous. David discovered his as a handwritten letter slipped under his apartment door, the ink smudged and hurried. Cassidy received hers as a cryptic text from an unknown number, accompanied by an address to an elegant masquerade ball. First, they all brushed it off. Life was hectic, and unsolicited messages were easy to ignore. Yet something about these invitations lingered. They whispered in their minds during quiet moments, growing louder and more insistent as New Year's Eve approached. Persistent call. For Olivia, the haunting began in her dreams. She saw herself standing before an ornate mirror in a room bathed in golden light. Her reflection was mesmerizing, her body leaner, her features flawless. But behind her, a shadow loomed, its outline indistinct yet suffocating. Every time she turned to look, it vanished, leaving only a chilling stillness. David, on the other hand, found himself stalked by peculiar patterns. Everywhere he went, the numbers 1231 appeared on receipts, flashing billboards, even his car's digital clock. He hadn't adjusted the time, yet it always seemed to echo the same message. The date itself felt alive, beckoning him to something inevitable. Cassidy, ever pragmatic and skeptical, dismissed the text at first. But as the days wore on, her thoughts kept drifting back to the address. A strange yearning grew within her, whispering that the masquerade might hold the adventure she'd been craving. A chance to break free from her monotonous life. The final decision. By New Year's Eve, all three had succumbed to the lure of their invitations. Olivia, determined to transform her life, downloaded the app linked in her email. It promised a structured journey to self-improvement, tailored specifically to her. As she input her details, her weight, goals, even her address, she felt a mix of anticipation and unease. David, driven by curiosity, visited the antique shop mentioned in the note. There, amid the musty shelves, he found an ornate clock that seemed to hum with a quiet rhythm, as if alive. Cassidy, dressed in her most elegant gown, hailed a cab. The address felt etched into her memory, though she barely recalled reading it. As the city's festive lights blurred past her window, excitement mingled with an undercurrent of dread. The unfolding stories. Olivia, the New Year's resolution. Olivia's app, Resolution Keeper, initially felt empowering. It sent encouraging messages like, "You're doing great," and "Stay focused." But as the days passed, the tone shifted. One morning, a message read, "We're watching you. Don't disappoint us." On New Year's Eve, as Olivia prepared a midnight snack, her phone buzzed violently. Violation detected. Locking food sources, the app warned. The fridge door slammed shut. The pantry clicked locked. Frantic, she tried to pry them open, but they wouldn't budge. Then came the second message. Resistance detected. Punishment initiated. The lights in her apartment flickered wildly. Mirrors shattered one by one, their shards scattering across the floor. In their reflections, Olivia saw herself, but not as she was. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her body skeletal. Her phone vibrated one final time. Congratulations, you've reached your goal. Welcome to the first gate. David, the countdown clock. David was mesmerized by the clock from the moment he saw it. Its ornate carvings and intricate design seemed to pulse with a life of their own. On New Year's Eve, as he wound it, the clock began to tick backward, its hands moving faster with every passing second. A cold breeze swept through the room, and faint whispers filled the air. Welcome, the time has come. When the clock struck midnight, it exploded into a flurry of gears and splinters. In its center lay a slip of paper, scorched at the edges, bearing the words, "You are the second gatekeeper." Before David could comprehend, a shadow emerged from the remnants, enveloping him in darkness. Cassidy, the masked guest. The mansion was a vision of opulence, its chandeliers casting golden light on masked guests. Cassidy felt out of place, yet inexplicably drawn to the grand ballroom. The guests' laughter echoed unnaturally, their movements fluid but mechanical. As midnight approached, the host, a tall figure in a golden mask, raised a glass and proclaimed, "To the final gate!" The guests cheered, but Cassidy noticed something horrifying. Their masks had fused to their faces, their eyes glowing with a ghostly light. Cassidy clawed at her own mask, but it tightened, digging into her skin. The host leaned close, his voice a cold whisper. "The third gate is sealed. Welcome to eternity. New Year's fate." The gate opens, with Olivia, David, and Cassidy unwittingly completing the ritual. 3 ancient gates opened, bridging the human world with a realm of malevolent entities. Shadows grew darker, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Whispers filled the air, carrying promises of power and threats of despair. The 3 became eternal gatekeepers, their souls bound to the threshold between worlds. But the ritual was far from over. The invitations continued, spreading like a plague, seeking new victims to sustain the gates. If you ever receive a message promising extraordinary change, consider this. The gates need more souls to remain open. Will you be next? Story 2. The New Year's Eve Curse. Behind the Mirror. In the snowy countryside of Vermont, USA, where a blanket of white covered the land during the year's end, lay the small town of Ridgemont. With a population of fewer than 2,000, it was known for chilling stories passed down through generations. Among them, the most terrifying was the New Year's Eve curse. People whispered that every New Year's Eve, when the clock struck midnight, anyone who gazed into a mirror might see a figure from another world staring back at them. But the most horrifying part? If you saw it, it would see you too, and it would never let you go. The beginning coming home. Emma, a 22-year-old recent college graduate, had returned home to spend New Year's with her family. Curious and skeptical by nature, Emma dismissed the townspeople's superstitions as exaggerated folklore. Yet deep down, she couldn't resist the allure of testing this curse herself. As her family busied themselves with New Year's preparations, Emma slipped away to the attic, a cold, dusty space her grandmother used to tell ghost stories in before she passed. Amidst the forgotten trinkets and cobwebs, Emma found an old mirror draped in a black cloth. Perfect, she thought, deciding to challenge the curse and prove it was nothing but nonsense. The fateful night. At 11:55 p.m., Emma set the mirror before her, lit a candle, and turned off the lights. The flickering flame cast strange, shifting shadows on the mirror's surface, as though the glass were alive. In the silence, the ticking of the clock downstairs grew louder, pounding like a drumbeat in her ears. 11:59 p.m. Emma stared into the mirror, her breath fogging the glass. A shiver crept up her spine as she felt the inexplicable sensation of being watched. She shook it off as her imagination. 12:00 a.m. The clock chimed midnight. The candle's flame sputtered, then extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. As Emma's eyes adjusted, she noticed something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror began to change. Her own image faded, replaced by a towering black figure with glowing red eyes and a twisted, malevolent grin. It stood directly behind her, unmoving, but its eyes pierced her like daggers. Emma screamed and spun around, but nothing was there. She bolted downstairs, but to her horror, the house was no longer the same. The kitchen, the living room, everything was shrouded in an oppressive, otherworldly darkness. Her family sat motionless on the couch, their faces blank and their eyes staring into nothingness. The horrible truth. Emma recalled fragments of the ghost stories her grandmother used to tell. Her grandmother had mentioned that the mirror was not just an ordinary object. It was a gateway connecting the human world to a realm of malevolent entities. The shadowy figure Emma saw was not a ghost. It was a predator, a being that could not be banished once summoned. Desperate for answers, Emma ran to her grandmother's old study, filled with ancient books and antiques. On a dusty shelf, she found a leather-bound notebook. Inside, her grandmother had written, "If you see it, destroy the mirror. But beware, time is your enemy. If it lingers beyond the night, it will claim you forever." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs. The entity was approaching. The confrontation. Emma raced back to the attic. The mirror stood there, undamaged, but the shadow within it was now moving. Its long, clawed hands reached for the edges of the glass, as though trying to pull itself out. Emma frantically searched for something to destroy the mirror. Spotting a wooden beam on the floor, she grabbed it and swung it at the glass. The mirror cracked but didn't shatter. The figure screamed, a bone-chilling sound like the cries of thousands of tormented souls. One clawed hand burst through the crack, slashing at the air. Emma screamed, summoning all her strength, and struck the mirror again. This time, it shattered into hundreds of shards. The shadowy figure let out a final, ear-splitting wail before dissolving into nothingness. The room trembled violently, then fell silent. The message. When Emma regained consciousness, everything seemed normal again. Her family had no memory of the night's events. But Emma knew it wasn't over. On one of the remaining shards of the mirror, a message was scrawled in what looked like blood. "I'm not finished. See you on another night." From that day forward, Emma avoided mirrors on New Year's Eve. But deep in her heart, she knew the shadow was still waiting, somewhere in the darkness, ready to return at the slightest mistake. Story 3. The Darkness of New Year's Eve. In a small village nestled deep in a valley, New Year's Eve was always considered the most sacred time of the year. The villagers believed that at the moment when the old year transitioned into the new, the boundary between the living and the dead became thinnest. It was said that lighting a 13th lantern on this night would open the gate between the two realms, allowing lost souls to return and seek what was taken from them. This story revolves around Lynn, a young woman who had recently moved to the village with her family. The house they chose to live in was an old wooden structure at the edge of the village, abandoned for many years. The locals avoided talking about it, as it was shrouded in tales of mysterious occurrences. Lynn, however, dismissed such superstitions, thinking they were merely old stories meant to scare children. On the last day of the year, the village was bustling with preparations for the new year. Red lanterns hung from every house, Children ran joyfully through the streets, and adults busied themselves cleaning altars and preparing offerings. In her new home, Lynn stood by the window, watching the faint glow of the setting sun over the misty road. Everything seemed unusually peaceful, but when she glanced up at the attic window, she noticed something strange. A small window that never seemed to go dark, day or night. Curious, Lynn decided to investigate. The attic was dim and dusty, filled with old belongings. Amid the clutter, she found a red lantern unlike any she had seen before. It was made of silk, but its red was dark, almost like blood, and strange symbols were embroidered across its surface. Lynn decided to hang the lantern downstairs, thinking it would add to the festive atmosphere. By 11 p.m., her family had finished their preparations and gathered around the altar to welcome the new year. Lynn lit the mysterious lantern, and its glow filled the house with an unusual warmth. But as soon as the lantern was lit, the house seemed to shudder slightly, and a cold draft swept through, despite all the windows being tightly shut. Lynn shivered but brushed it off as a fleeting chill. At exactly 11:59 p.m., as the family waited for the countdown, there was a knock at the door, 3 deliberate, slow knocks. It was strange, as everyone in the village would be home with their families at this time. Lynn opened the door, but there was no one outside. Instead, she found an old pair of tattered slippers, damp as if they had been left in the rain. Puzzled, Lynn picked up the slippers. Suddenly, she heard a faint, eerie laugh behind her, like that of a woman. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her family, oblivious to the sound, reassured her that she was imagining things. But from that moment on, odd occurrences began to unfold. Shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, shifting with the flickering light of the red lantern. Footsteps echoed from the attic, though no one had gone upstairs. Lynn began to feel an unshakable presence, something unseen but ever watchful. As the clock struck midnight, a strong gust of wind extinguished every light in the house, except for the red lantern. Its glow deepened into a fiery crimson, casting an eerie light throughout the room. In the mirror, Lynn saw the reflection of a figure, a woman in a whiteout dye with long, disheveled hair. Her face was partially obscured, but her eyes glowed red like burning coals. The figure spoke in a raspy yet chillingly clear voice. "Give it back what is mine!" Lynn screamed and ran downstairs, but every window and door was inexplicably locked. Her family was nowhere to be found. Desperately, she grabbed the lantern and tried to extinguish it, but each time she touched it, an invisible force shoved her backward. In her panic, Lynn realized the 13th lantern was the source of it all. She rushed to the window and hurled the lantern outside. As it shattered on the ground, an unearthly scream pierced the night air. Suddenly, everything returned to normal. The lights came back on, her family reappeared, and the house felt warm again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, however, when villagers came to wish Lynn's family a happy new year, they found the house empty. No trace of the family remained. On the doorstep were the same tattered, wet slippers, and in the yard, the torn remains of the red lantern. Since that day, the warning about the 13th lantern has become an unshakable part of the village's lore. On every New Year's Eve, villagers whisper that if you peer into the darkness, you might see a shadow standing silently, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to break the curse again. Story 4. The Village on New Year's Eve. The Legend of the Lost Village. Deep within a dense northern forest lies a village absent from any map. Locals tell tales of this mysterious place, warning that anyone venturing there on New Year's Eve never returns. Stories of the eerie village have circulated for decades, from shadowy figures wandering the woods to chilling whispers in the dead of night. But curiosity is a deadly weapon. On New Year's Eve 2005, a group of 4 young friends decided to uncover the truth, ignoring all warnings. They believed the legends were merely figments of wild imaginations. Journey into the darkness. The group began their trek in the late afternoon of the last day of the year, under a sky heavy with foreboding clouds. The forest loomed around them, its branches like skeletal hands waiting to seize them. As twilight deepened, they came upon an old wooden gate. Carved deeply into its surface were the words, "On New Year's Eve, once you enter, you can never leave." Rather than turn back, the group pressed on. The gate creaked open by itself, its rusty hinges groaning as if issuing a final warning. The village of death. Beyond the gate lay a desolate village, cloaked in thick layers of dust. Dilapidated wooden houses stood scattered, their black windows resembling empty eye sockets. Not a soul was in sight. At the stroke of midnight, a church bell rang from somewhere deep within the village. Startled, the group turned to see a tall, gaunt figure in a black cloak standing in the middle of the square. The figure said nothing but raised a bony hand to point at the largest house in the village. The House of Truth. Reluctantly, they entered the house. The walls were lined with portraits of families who once lived there, but all their faces were scratched out. A massive mirror hung in the center of the living room, trembling violently. As the group approached, the mirror emitted a blinding light, revealing their reflections. But the versions in the mirror were not ordinary reflections. They grinned back with twisted, maniacal smiles. A cold voice echoed through the room. Asterisk, you have come, and now you belong to this place. Asterisk. A futile escape. Terrified, the friends bolted out of the house, running toward the village gate. But the gate had vanished. In its place, the surrounding forest seemed alive, its trees shifting and closing in as if to trap them forever. Laughter rang out from every direction. One of the group, Hui, suddenly stopped, his eyes glazed over. "Stop running," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. To the horror of his friends, Hui turned and walked straight into the darkness. The forgotten ending. The next morning, villagers found the group's car at the forest's edge, but the friends were nowhere to be seen. A year later, a traveler passing through the area claimed to have seen 4 shadowy figures in the abandoned village houses. Their eyes were vacant, but their mouths twisted into eerie, unnatural smiles. The village remains, waiting for the next curious souls to arrive. Story 5. The Curse of New Year's Eve. The village that feared midnight. Nestled in the shadow of towering, snow-capped peaks lay a small, secluded village called Lanestone. From a distance, it appeared idyllic, with its cozy cottages and winding cobblestone streets. But as night fell, an unsettling stillness gripped the air. For generations, the villagers lived under the weight of a sinister legend, a curse tied to New Year's Eve. They said that at the stroke of midnight, the ancient bell in the clock tower would toll not 12, but 13 times. And with each unnatural chime, the boundary between the living and the dead blurred, unleashing something dark that roamed the streets, hunting for those who dared to ignore the warnings. The origin of the curse. Long ago, the village was ruled by a merciless noble named Lord Elwyn. He was infamous for his insatiable greed, imposing brutal taxes and forcing the villagers into servitude. On a freezing New Year's Eve, after years of suffering, the villagers revolted. They stormed his manor with torches and blades, dragging him into the square where they lit a pyre. But Elwyn did not beg for mercy. Instead, as the flames consumed him, He chanted words in a forgotten tongue, his voice echoing through the icy night. Asterisk, let this night mark my return. Let those who forget pay with their souls. Asterisk, from that night onward, tragedy struck the village each New Year's Eve. Shadows moved where no light fell. Unseen hands rattled doors. And those who defied the warnings, those who ventured out, were never seen again. The modern defiance. By the 21st century, many in Lanestone dismissed the curse as folklore. Among them was Clara, a spirited young schoolteacher who had moved to the village only months earlier. When New Year's Eve approached, Clara decided to host a party, inviting friends from the nearby town to her cozy cottage. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitlock, tried to dissuade her. "You don't understand, child," the old woman said, her voice trembling. "The curse is real. When the 13th chime sounds, you must stay inside, silent, with no light to betray your presence." Clara laughed it off. "It's just an old wives' tale," she insisted. "You should join us for the party." But Mrs. Whitlock's pale face and shaking hands lingered in Clara's mind as the night began. The clock strikes midnight. The evening was filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of a crackling fire. Snow fell gently outside, blanketing the world in a serene white silence. At precisely midnight, the ancient clock tower began to toll. The first 12 chimes rang out, deep and sonorous, echoing through the still air. But then came the 13th chime, a harsh, discordant note that seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone present. The fire in the hearth flickered violently and died, plunging the room into darkness. A cold, oppressive fog seeped under the door and through the windows, coiling around the partygoers. Then came the knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps at the door. The group fell silent, their earlier cheer replaced by a mounting dread. Clara approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Gathering her courage, she opened the door, revealing only the swirling fog. But in the distance, just visible through the haze, a tall figure stood motionless, its face obscured by shadow. The haunting begins. One by one, Clara's guests began to act strangely. Mark, who had stepped outside to investigate, returned pale and trembling. "There's something out there," he whispered, "watching us." Moments later, he disappeared. The group heard his scream echo through the forest, a sound that faded into an unnatural silence. Lucy, the youngest of the group, began muttering incoherently, her eyes wide with terror. "They're in the dark," she said, waiting. Clara tried to call for help, but her phone displayed only static. The landline was dead. Desperate, she remembered Mrs. Whitlock's warning and decided to seek her advice. The warning in the mirror. At Mrs. Whitlock's house, Clara found the door ajar. Inside, the old woman's living room was eerily quiet. On the dining table lay a note in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, do not look into the mirror after the 13th chime. Asterisk. Clara's breath caught as she realized the room's antique mirror was cracked. She saw her reflection, but something was wrong. Her reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it smiled, a slow, malicious grin, and raised a finger to its lips, as if to silence her. The final toll. The 13th chime rang out again, louder and more jarring than before. Clara turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the fog outside. Its glowing red eyes locked onto her as it stepped closer. The mirror shattered, and Clara felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. The villagers found Clara's cottage the next morning. She and her friends were gone, but their faces lingered in the shards of the broken mirror, frozen in expressions of unspeakable terror. The legacy of the curse. To this day, Lanestone remains gripped by fear each New Year's Eve. When the clock strikes midnight, the villagers extinguish their lights and huddle in silence, praying for dawn. But some say the echoes of laughter and screams still carry on the wind, and shadowy figures move through the fog, replaying their final moments again and again. Will you dare to visit Lanestone this New Year's Eve?